My name is Emma Bliss. I am 33 years old. I'm a carrier for myotubular myopathy. I live in New Hampshire with my husband, who is a furniture maker, my 6-year old son, and my 1-year old daughter. I learned about my carrier status of being a carrier of myotubular myopathy when my second son was born in 2017. After a perfect pregnancy, Caleb was born with many complications. He was born at 34 weeks due to polyhydramnios. And we didn't really get answers about his condition until around 4 months of our NICU stay. And we found out answers through doing a whole exome sequence genetic testing on Caleb. Caleb lived for 5 months and passed away peacefully in the NICU. We were devastated by the diagnosis and knew from the test that we didn't want Caleb's entire life to be invasive procedures, hospitalizations, medical care. So we chose the route of comfort for him, which ultimately meant that his life was shortened. But we have found peace and healing knowing he didn't have to go through those things. But I learned I was a carrier for myotubular myopathy through his diagnosis. For males, a lot of them are born, the very first symptom is hypotonia. So they have low muscle tone. That's muscle weakness, and low muscle tone is like the most obvious symptom. The one that really affects them and ends up being the fatality syndrome in most of the boys with MTM is the fact that their muscle weakness is included in their breathing and um, swallowing. So a lot of them have all of them have feeding difficulties and breathing difficulties. And a lot of the times what happens is they have to have a tracheostomy, or they have to have like a BiPAP. They have to have a feeding tube. A lot of them are wheelchair bound. But the breathing is really the most affected. And in Caleb's condition, it was what ended up being the reason he passed away. His lungs collapsed because they just weren't strong enough. And most of the MTM boys require some assistance in breathing and feeding, if not all. For women carriers, it's very gray and controversial. There's a lot of women that would say that they have muscle weakness as well. But women carriers, they don't tend to have severe symptoms. Some of the symptoms will include breathing coordination and like low breathing capacity. Muscle weakness again is probably the number one though that is experienced. There's only, I would say, a dozen or so that I can think of that women that have severe or closer to severe symptoms that would be close to the boys. I have a son who is going to be 7, and he was my first child. He is my first child, and he was a perfectly healthy pregnancy. So it was very standard. I was low risk. I didn't do much testing in that pregnancy. And then for Caleb's pregnancy, it was the same route. I was low risk. We didn't do much testing. But then after Caleb passed away, we knew that we wanted to expand our family. So we met with genetic counselors. We talked about our options. We talked with genetic professionals. Like we just had as many conversations as we could with as many people that in the field. We didn't have issues with conception. So for us, it seemed like the easiest and quickest route to have another baby would be to try again naturally. Um, so that was what we chose to do. We got pregnant soon after Caleb's passing in 2019. And in that pregnancy, I did do a chorionic villus sampling, a CVS test at 11 weeks. And it was determined that that baby boy was affected with MTM. We made the difficult decision at that point to terminate the pregnancy at 13 weeks, as we didn't want to put another baby through what Caleb went through. And at that point, we just kind of felt lost. We realized having to terminate a pregnancy was a lot more difficult emotionally than we had thought it would be. So we decided to start doing the prep work for IVF. I had all the preliminary testing done. I had the procedure done in IVF. I was working with a lab to build a probe. I had a $40,000 estimate to start it all. Crazy. I know it was crazy. 10,000 of that cost was going to go directly to the lab to create the probe, which would have been a one-time cost and event. But it was about 30,000 per round for us in New Hampshire. Insurance doesn't cover anything. Um, and then at that time, while I was working with the lab, I found out I was pregnant again accidentally. And at first, I was extremely disappointed in myself. I had put all my hope into IVF and I didn't want to have to consider terminating another pregnancy. So it was a very scary time for us. We decided to go the route of the Panorama non invasive genetic test, and that determined that the baby was a girl. And from there, we decided not to do any further testing because we wouldn't terminate a carrier girl of MTM. So the risks of doing a CVS or an amnio outweighed the benefits for us. And then this past year, well, 2020, Isla was born and is a perfect 1-year-old now. We don't know her carrier status, but she appears to be an asymptomatic carrier like myself. Honestly, I'm 33 years old. So for me, in the back of my mind, time was a big one.
Mhm.
I did not, I mean, I have 2 years until I am a geriatric pregnancy. So time was the biggest choice. I know that IVF takes, there's a lot of prep work. You
Mhm.
start meeting with people and you really don't start the actual process of being pregnant for like 4 or 5 months. And that's if it takes. But for us, going the natural route just it ended up making sense. I think the way that it happened was the way that it was supposed to happen, and I know that's a difficult thing to hear when you're trying to conceive, but I think when everybody can agree that after all of it, after you get the family that you're looking for, that when you look back, you're like, it happened the way that it was supposed to. So I think we need to put more faith into that. Natural conception, the challenges are that there's a high chance that you might have to terminate that pregnancy, or you go through and you have another affected child. Like those, everybody's going to have their beliefs on what is right with termination, right? Like that's a very controversial topic. But for us, I would never put a baby through what Caleb went through. So that was the only option for us. And I don't know if I would do that again. If I had to, if we decided we wanted to have another baby, I would heavily look into IVF as the option. Only because that's what gives us the guarantee of a healthy baby at the end of the day. Well, um, I say this every once in a while. I don't know how I feel. So with Isla, we did not do genetic testing outside of the standard. Well, not standard, but it was a panorama genetic, non-invasive genetic test. So it told us if she would have any chromosome issues, and it told us the gender. So if I were to go back to that, I might consider testing her via CVS or chorionic villus sampling at that time, because then I would have her genetic issues answers now. And I'm finding it very difficult to get those answers now. But in pregnancy, that's always an option as long as you're willing to take that risk. But now a lot of the genetic counselors are telling us that we should wait until she's 18 and she makes the decision to do the genetic testing, which I, on one hand, completely agree. On the other hand, I just want to know. I want to know if she's a carrier for many reasons, for her own health growing up too. So if I were to go back to when we were family planning, I might consider testing her in pregnancy for the condition. And if I could go back to when we first started planning our family after Caleb passed, I would just tell myself not to worry so much. I loved the idea of IVF, and although terminating a pregnancy was not an enjoyable experience, um, I still believe it was the right path for us at the end of the day.